The Denver Broncos have put together a list of undrafted rookie free agent signings to invite to minicamp 2 weeks away. Who's the next Chris Harris Jr.? Who's the next Rod Smith? We discuss that and much more in today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to all the avid listeners in Broncos Country who tune in every single day and make us your first listen. Shout out to all the everyday listeners who listen all throughout the week here. Locked on Broncos. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, and more from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my good friend, co-host of the show, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Broncos Country, we are close to 10K YouTube subscribers, so make sure you subscribe so we can get closer there. Our goal is to hit 10K by the time the season starts. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for everything that you do, listening to the show, watching the show, making it is what it is. So, I mean, Sayre, as grateful as we are for Broncos Country, there is a lot to discuss here following the NFL draft. The conclusion, it's all over, and we didn't have to wait 2.5 hours, for the press conference to happen after the draft because they were calling undrafted guys saying, hey, you want to come to Denver or you don't. They had scouts do that, and they were able to go through on Saturday and finalize everything. But now the Broncos' undrafted rookie free agent class, for the most part, Sayre, is set, and there's some intriguing names there we'll talk about.
There are some really intriguing names on here, Cody. And of course, one of the great things about signing undrafted free agents is a lot of times, you look at, well, who's the best available after the draft? Those aren't typically, and maybe sometimes, but they're not typically the guys that end up being those training camp standouts, those preseason superstars, right? The guys that get the low signing bonuses. Like, remember last offseason, I think it was Brandon Johnson who got the lowest signing bonus of any of the undrafted guys. Turned out to be maybe one of the Broncos' better pickups in that class. But then, of course, you do have guys like Jalen Virgil who got a big signing bonus, got a big contract guarantee, made the team. Who could be the versions of those guys from this? We don't know exactly the numbers in terms of signing bonuses, Cody, but we do know that maybe at the top of this list, Houston cornerback Art Green, Central Michigan edge defender Thomas Incoom, and Fort Valley State running back Emmanuel Wilson. Will start there with 3 names for fans to kind of get to know. I think those 3 have as good a chance of anybody on this list of maybe cracking the roster. And there's certainly, some balance to this as well. It looks like we've got at this point in time, like 14 to 16 names to keep an eye on, but certainly those are a couple to start with.
Well, and aside from that as well, Denver tapping into the HBCU, which I think is absolutely important. I know Deion Sanders, he's just up the road in Boulder, said that he was disappointed that just one HBCU player was drafted overall, and I think it was to the New England Patriots, and I think it was a cornerback there, but it's tough when the exposure doesn't get as much, that it deserves at the HBCU level. I know that there's been steps taken to kind of rectify that. It's going to be a continuous process. But now that Deion's left, hopefully, there is a promise by these networks to increase the exposure of players who play at historically black college universities and get that proper exposure that they deserve here. But man, I tell you what, this is always an interesting time of the year when you talk about undrafted guys because for the most part, like us as analysts, fans for the most part, unless you're like diehard supporters of these teams, we don't really know too much about a lot of these undrafted guys, right? It forces us to study upon them a little bit. I know that Broncos fans, when we were going through the NFL draft process, recapping it, some fans were saying, how come they didn't draft a running back? How come they didn't draft an offensive tackle? How come they didn't go with this position? But, when you look at undrafted guys, and even Sean Payton said it, and George Payton said it as well, when we talked to them on Saturday, after the draft concluded, he said, hey, there's a lot of guys that we have on our list that we, looked that or project to be available here to sign as rookie free agents. And that's a great opportunity for them to get into the system and plug and play. So there's so much competition, right? You talk about wide receivers. Let's go down the list here. Jackson State wide receiver, Dallas Daniels, Incarnate Word wide receiver, Taylor Grimes, and you go down the list even further to some other guys there. Tight end, South Carolina's Nate Atkins, another tight end, Kent State's Chris Leach. So you're adding to that room here to see in rookie minicamp and tryouts, which will be 2 weeks away from now, and you're going to see which these guys will come in and compete. Now you go to the offensive line, Illinois offensive tackle, Alex. Now you might know this one. I can't. How do you pronounce his name? Because it is a unique spelling. Czeeuski. Pacheski, is that how you pronounce it?
I think it's Palczewski, Cody. Alex Palczewski, the third-team All-American from Illinois and a longtime starter for them. Somebody that I think, hey, we'll talk about this as we go along, but maybe he's one of those sleepers to be keeping an eye on. Then you go from the Big Ten to the Ivy League, Princeton offensive lineman Henry Bird, and it's going to be fun to see those two guys. Damani Leach, we know he loves it. We know, and Kyle Brandt as well, a Princeton grad there from Good Morning Football. And then you go to the defensive line, Cody, PJ Mustipher from Penn State. Of course, you know, those two Big Ten guys there in the trenches, I think will be interesting on either side of the ball to watch. And you stay in the Big Ten. It looks like a lot of the more prominent guys the Broncos signed as undrafted free agents this year from the Big Ten. Iowa linebacker Seth Benson, Cody. This one is an interesting one for me because, you know, I'm a Hawkeyes guy, obviously, but also Seth Benson actually graduated from the same high school as me in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is about as it's about as niche as it gets when you're talking about a connection, right? You got to go to South Dakota first and foremost, then you got to go to Sioux Falls, and then you got to go to the one high school. So it's kind of a cool little connection there to see that. I don't know Seth or his family personally, but I mean, Sioux Falls is a small enough town that I'm sure we have like a 3 degrees of separation kind of thing going on there. So kind of cool to see that, but I think he's a name to keep an eye on as well.
Some other names here: Western Colorado cornerback Darius Gaines, Indiana safety Devin Matthews, and then you have Youngstown State running back Jaleel McLaughlin. And then there's some other guys as well that have received an invite to rookie minicamp and tryouts next week. Incarnate Word linebacker Chris Whitaker and San Diego quarterback Judd Erickson. And that kind of makes up realistically your undrafted rookie free agent class going into training camp, because a lot of these guys, and we'll see how it goes 2 weeks from now at the tryout, but a lot of these guys will transition from, you know, being on this roster, trying out to, okay, hey, maybe we just don't see this guy being a fit for us on the 90-man roster going into mini camp, going into training camp, but we'll see a good portion of the roster finalized for training camp through the preseason. And as we all know, the NFL made a new rule where you don't have to cut down necessarily after each preseason game. It's by after that last preseason game where you're going to have to go from 90 to 53, but I imagine we will still see teams make cuts after preseason games just so they can get to where they want if they feel like, okay, hey, this guy he doesn't fit what we want to do. And we'll see if any of these undrafted guys kind of have an opportunity to kind of creep in. But as we continue on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, we appreciate you so much for tuning in. Broncos Country, what positions have the best shot for an undrafted rookie free agent to maybe make the 53-man roster here in 2023? The Broncos have had a really good streak with that. We'll talk about that, and we'll discuss that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at Built Bar. You've heard me rave about it. You've heard Sayre rave about it. Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar that is out there on the market today. When you think about protein bars, sometimes you associate that with poor tasting, healthy stuff. But when you talk about Built Bar, you get jam-packed protein. You get things that taste legitimately like a candy bar, and it's also healthy for you. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. Each bar contains 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, low sugar, and they're covered in 100% milk chocolate with flavors like churro, brownie batter, peanut butter brownie, peanut butter puff. They have the Built Bars. They have the Puff Bars. And if you haven't tried a Puff Bar, you need to do that as well. Sayre has even talked about melting it over his new fire pit that he got because he loves chocolate and he loves dessert. And it could be s'more season as well. You can make that with Built today, and you can go to Built.com. But we encourage you, if you have a Sam's Club or you have a Walmart, go to Walmart to the pharmacy side, get a box of 4 Built Bars. If you go to Sam's Club, you get a bulk box of 13 bars today. Check it out, Built.com.
Which position groups have the best shot for an undrafted free agent to make the Denver Broncos 53-man roster in 2023. This is an interesting discussion because all throughout the pre-draft process, we talk about taking players, not necessarily positions. But now with the 90-man roster relatively filled out, Cody, we can kind of look at these young players coming in, these undrafted rookies coming in, and we can kind of determine, regardless of the signing bonus or the contract guarantee that a player receives, we know even at the highest contract guarantee, that player could end up getting cut. That player could end up being on the practice squad. They could end up on the active roster. We have no idea where these guys are going to end up. I think a lot of it is determined by obviously the competition at position groups and where the Broncos maybe need some depth, where they maybe need some bodies, where somebody could feasibly step up and actually carve out a role on this team. Going to be a lot of fun to watch. What say you, though? What position or positions do you feel like have the best shot for these undrafted guys coming in to crack the roster?
This is a great question because there's a lot of undrafted rookie free agents that Denver added to the list, but you also look at maybe as what George Paton and Sean Payton said leading up to the draft before they made any of their picks. They said, hey, we have a very good foundation in place on defense, right? So for me, I'm looking at that. I'm like, okay, well, they add a couple guys in the NFL draft. To me, the only defensive position I can maybe see an undrafted guy maybe making the roster would be at edge rusher, considering now, okay, hey, you have Randy Gregory, you have Baron Browning, you have Jonathan Cooper, Jacob Martin, Aaron Patrick, Nick Bonito. You have 6 guys there, but at the same time, like, how do you envision that? Like, Aaron Patrick is coming off the ACL. You obviously have, hope that Randy Gregory can stay healthy for an entire season. He and Baron are expected to project to start. You have Jonathan Cooper, who's a reliable option. What's Nick Bonito going to do in terms of taking the next step? And then you have Jacob Martin. I mean, I think realistically speaking, maybe Aaron Patrick, Jacob Martin, those 2 roster spots at the edge rusher position could be maybe up for grabs a little bit. I don't want to make any absolute guarantees here at this point, but defensively, if they're going to add a position there that's an undrafted guy that maybe could make it, it could be the edge rusher position. I know a few years ago they had Andre Mintz. Now, several years ago, you had Malik Reed who did the same exact thing. And so you got to find the trend, right? Edge rusher has been one of those positions where the Broncos have found a guy there. And as we've talked about, you do have an edge rusher from Central Michigan, Thomas Incoom. We'll talk about him a little bit later on as the show progresses here, Locked On Broncos. But aside from that, offensively, maybe running back, right? Because that was the one position everybody in Broncos country wanted them to add at least another player in the NFL draft. They have a couple of options as we talk about Fort Valley State running back Emmanuel Wilson, and then you also talk about Jaleel McLaughlin out of Youngstown State. See what these guys can do. Like I said, we don't know too much about a lot of these prospects here. We're going to be in the information gathering stage when I attend rookie minicamp here in 2 weeks. I think we get access to that from a media perspective. I'll have to double check and see. But if we get access to that, we'll be able to have a little bit more insight and information as to maybe what these guys may look like. To be honest with you, Sayre, I mean, it could be any position at this point, maybe minus quarterback. Obviously, San Diego quarterback Judd Erickson getting an invite 2 weeks from now. How do you feel maybe about which position group that, makes up the undrafted rookie list here for the Broncos maybe could have a better chance to make it?
Well, I do like your pick of edge rusher, Cody, because as we've seen in the past, like even Shaquille Barrett back in 2014, he made the roster with 2 Hall of Famers already on it. So, I mean, you just never know when these guys are going to show up and show out. And you can't look at it always necessarily too like, well, this position is way too loaded. There's no way an undrafted guy could make it. Well, you could maybe say trade somebody and replace him with the undrafted guy who's going to be a cheaper option. Who knows if you have a chance to get capital, what the team might do. I'm going to choose cornerback defensively, though, Cody, because I think you look at that depth chart right now. Obviously, Pat Surtain, Damari Mathis. Now you drafted Riley Moss to be in that third cornerback role or the backup outside corner, and then you've got K'Wan Williams in the slot. You did bring back Isang Bass. You've got Jaquan McMillan out there.
2 undrafted guys. I don't know
that. Two former undrafted guys. As speak of the Devils, right? We're talking about undrafted guys making contributions. If any position on defense is going to have somebody jump in, I think cornerback is one to watch. Now, like you said, we're still in the information gathering stage about guys like Art Green out of Houston. We're still getting to know Western Colorado cornerback Darius Gaines. So maybe after we record this episode. Of course, we want to get all this information out to all of you listeners out there as soon as we can. As we gather info, as we watch some of these guys play, maybe we'll come back and say, hey, remember what we talked about? We were in that information gathering stage. Well, the information has been gathered, and this guy looks like he's going to be an absolute stud. Maybe we'll get to that point. As of right now, I think corner, and then I agree with you with the offensive side of the ball being running back has that best shot. Cody, Sean Payton made a little comment at the draft on day 3 after during that little press conference that they did there, him and George Payton. He made a kind of a comment about the last time we had a running back starting in the Super Bowl, it was an undrafted guy. Kind of can't help but wonder, is he trying to maybe manifest another one for the Denver Broncos? So obviously that's a bit of a tinfoil hat kind of a theory, but at the same time, kind of interesting to think, right? I can't remember exactly when the Steelers added Pierre Thomas back in or not the Steelers, excuse me, the Saints. When the Saints added Pierre Thomas to that running back room, can't remember exactly what year that was, but maybe Sean Payton's kind of looking for that undrafted free agent, that player who could come in and be a spark for this offense while Javonte Williams continues to recover.
What are some things that Sean Payton has said throughout the draft process? Makeup, right? Like if anyone understands what the makeup is of a player who maybe fits what he's looking for from a coaching standpoint, makes sense. Absolutely, 100%. And I think that's where I trust Sean Payton. Now, at the top of my head, I'm not sure during Sean Payton's tenure in New Orleans how many undrafted rookie free agents made the roster. And look, I think a lot of times we look at, okay, who's the undrafted guy that's going to make the 53? But there's also a lot of undrafted guys that, they get cut initially when the roster's being, trimmed down, but then they're brought back onto the practice squad. And I'm intrigued to see maybe how many of these guys, if they don't make the active roster, do come back to the practice squad initially when it's all said and done right before the season begins. And it's an intriguing conversation to have in Broncos country as we talk about these prospects and as we've outlined who the undrafted rookie free agents have been here for the Broncos here going into 2023 rookie minicamp and tryout here 2 weeks from now. Who are some players that maybe caught your eye, that you've already looked up highlights on, that you feel like, hey, I want to see a little bit more of this guy in Denver? Make sure if you're watching on YouTube, you drop it in the comments down below. If you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, make sure you tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. We always appreciate you interacting here, Broncos country. On today's episode of the show, we're going to continue by talking about maybe which players Sayre and I individually think taking a shot from way downtown like Steph Curry, which players do we think could have the better chance to make the 53-man roster in 2023. We're going to give our bold predictions. You get that on today's episode of the show. Real quick, I want to tell you about the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast hosted by the Draft Dudes. Joe Marino, Kyle Krabs have you covered on how to assemble an NFL team from salary cap management through the NFL draft, through free agency. How do teams philosophically build a franchise in a way that can compete for Super Bowls? They go through and they look at it from a post-draft perspective all throughout this week on the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast with the Draft Dudes. Check it out on your favorite audio podcasting platform or whether you watch on YouTube. I mentioned an analogy a little bit earlier in the show about taking a shot from downtown like Steph Curry. I need to get on the same page here because I'm in Denver, Colorado. I'm a diehard Nuggets fan, like Jamal Murray was in Game 1 against the Phoenix Suns. That's my correction. I apologize, Broncos country, if you're a Nuggets fan watching. Also, make sure you check out the Locked On Nuggets podcast hosted by Adam Mares and Matt Moore. The Denver Nuggets will take on the Phoenix Suns on Monday for Game 2 at Ball Arena. Check out all the action, all the recap, and all the coverage there as well. Had to throw that in there, Sayre, as we talk about undrafted rookie free agents today for this Denver Broncos team. I know you're a Bulls fan. I know they're not in the playoffs. But you know what? This is a big time for Colorado sports fans, so hopefully you can hop on this Nuggets train with us here as we go. I'm gonna dish it to you, though, here to kind of start us off here in this final portion of today's episode, Locked On Broncos, calling our shots from downtown. Are there any players that have your eye here that you feel like maybe right now, looking at name, looking at position, maybe looking at value, you feel have the better chance of making the 53 in 2023?
Well, we talked about the running back position offensively being that one spot that could be maybe the most likely at this point. And I made a mention of Pierre Thomas, right? And the research department here at Locked On Broncos has informed me, I looked this up during that last ad. Pierre Thomas was signed in 2007 by the Saints, Cody. Actually, interesting factoid, that year, when look at that, and we've got a Loki appearance. This is just a celebrity kind of day. We're talking
Damn
Pierre
cats,
Thomas,
man.
we're talking Loki. You gotta love it. We got the child behind me, Din Grogu here. But Cody, Pierre Thomas, he was undrafted in 2007. He actually replaced a 4th-round pick from that same rookie class. So I think Sean Payton referenced that actually during the post-draft press conference. He talked about he was just kind of vamping on the whole situation. He was like, I've had 4th-round picks that I've cut, specifically this back that they cut in 2007. So he was referencing maybe this specific situation where the undrafted Pierre Thomas came in, unseated a 4th-round pick. I think obviously we don't have that kind of situation here, but we do have a situation with 2 running backs in this class. Jaleel McLaughlin, Cody, is the guy that I'm going to say we need to keep an eye on. The NCAA all-time leader in rushing yards, which is insane to think about, like how many great running backs have there been. But this is a unique era for college players, isn't it? Because of the pandemic year, you get the extra eligibility. You can transfer and play right away now. So Jaleel McLaughlin of Youngstown State ran for over 8,000 yards at the college level, 79 touchdowns. And this guy is just productivity and lightning in a bottle, right? I mean, he's not the most impressive physical specimen at 5'8", 192, but at the same time, he's a playmaker out there, Cody. He's definitely got that playmaker gene, looking for daylight. I'm gonna start off by just kind of set the bar with Jaleel McLaughlin here as the undrafted free agent. If I'm calling it from downtown, I'm calling it Jamal Murray style. I'm taking Jaleel McLaughlin as of today.
I'm going to stick with the running back position here, and I'm going to look at Emmanuel Wilson out of Fort Valley State now in his 2 seasons there at Fort Valley here. Interesting enough, from like his makeup standpoint, he's 6'1". He is 200, I believe, and 20 pounds. 220 pounds at 6'1". That's pretty good size there. Who kind of reminds us a little bit of that? I mean, he's a little taller, but like Latavius Murray kind of fits that mold a little bit here. So let's take a look at him in 2022. Let's take a look at some of his season highs. He had in the season opener for them 262 rushing yards on the ground against Tuskegee, 2 touchdowns. His longest rush of the year was 90 yards, and he surpassed over 1,000 yards in both seasons here. Now in 2020, actually, correction, he had 835 yards in his first season, but in his second season in 2022 at Fort Valley State, 1,200 yards rushing on 184 attempts, 15 touchdowns on the ground, and he was averaging 6.8 yards per carry and over 139 rushing yards per game. So when you look at the size that he has there, the ability to produce in the red zone, the ability to burst on big-time runs, that's something that maybe stands out to me a little bit. He doesn't have a large sample size in terms of the receiving department. He only has 31 career catches in 2 years for 278 yards and 2 touchdowns overall. But, this is a guy with his size, with his ability, and I'm just looking at some of his game log stats here. This is a guy who saw a very, very healthy workload in terms of the season. Like, he was deemed a little bit of a bell cow in a lot of these games where it looks like the only games he didn't have 20 carries were 2 games this season. Against Morehouse, he had 9 carries for 129 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, and against Clark Atlanta, he had 17 carries for $163 and 3 touchdowns. Aside from that, every other game, he had 20-plus carries overall. So maybe when we're looking at size, we're looking at bulk, we're looking at makeup, a comparison would be Latavius Murray in a sense, who Sean Payton has expressed a lot of love for. Surprising we didn't get to see him brought back in free agency, but this could be one of those guys there, Sayre, at the position. I do think running back has a really good chance considering where they're at with Javante's injury. And that's the thing about Javante's injury, that I think there's a lot of confusion about it, right? I see a lot of people saying he's not going to be ready this season, but we haven't had any confirmation of that. We just don't know what the timeline is going to be. We hear he's on track, but that's really on track for his recovery timeline, which we also don't know as well. So it's up in the air. To me, running back, I think Denver wouldn't be making a bad decision if they were to do that. If I'm not mistaken, Demaria Crockett on the roster was also undrafted, if I'm not mistaken.
He was.
So
He was.
running back
Cody.
is the friendly position here.
Yeah, it is. It is absolutely. And I think just a couple quick names as well to throw into the mix. I'll go with my Iowa Hawkeyes. Cody, I got to stay with them, right? Seth Benson. We've seen a couple of Iowa Hawkeyes really do well in this Denver Broncos, I guess, franchise over the last handful of years. There was a stretch there where they weren't really bringing in any Hawkeyes, but let's just say Seth Benson comes in and lights it up on special teams. You watch that Iowa defense. Jack Campbell was really the premier guy in that defense, kind of did a little bit of everything. But Seth Benson, you heard his name called time and time again. He's always out there making plays. So I like him as an option, especially to contribute on special teams. And I'm going to give a shout out to Palczewski, right? The All-American offensive lineman out of Illinois. Cody, the dude started just a ton of games at Illinois, played left tackle, right guard, did a little bit of everything. Maybe somebody right there who could profile as kind of that swing offensive lineman. We talked about the Broncos losing Cam Fleming and Billy Turner to free agency, at least as of today. But maybe this guy is a guy who comes in, an undrafted player, come in and impress at multiple positions and give the team a versatile option behind
another
your
option
starters.
like that on the roster is Quinn Bailey. Quinn Bailey's also one of those guys. So, hey, you know what? There's some guys, and he's been on the roster since 2019. So you could find guys and develop them. Like, if you go undrafted, there is a really good path. Look, it's going to be hard to make it into the NFL, but if you are a guy who has physical traits, can understand scheme, can stay healthy, there is a great opportunity that you could eventually find your way in. I mean, heck, last year, Calvin Anderson was an undrafted rookie free agent and started some games for the Broncos throughout his tenure in Denver as well. So the undrafted path isn't necessarily the end of the road. Even, guys like Alex Singleton, undrafted, got a 3-year contract. So I think the good message for any undrafted guy that maybe stumbles upon this podcast and is listening to us talk about it, it's not about where you go. It's about what you do with the opportunity you're given. You have rookie minicamp here in 2 weeks, and you know what? Embrace it. Be coachable and give it your all, because this is a great opportunity for you to really showcase maybe why NFL teams should have taken you in the NFL draft. Broncos Country, we're always excited for your thoughts. Make sure you drop them down below on YouTube if you're watching, or if you're listening on your favorite podcasting provider. You can always tweet us to share your thoughts, your feedback at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. We appreciate you so much for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day every single day. We're going to take a look at maybe how the additions of the Broncos draft class here in 2023 impact the depth chart. We do a little bit of projection. Is there any player who's negatively impacted by the arrival of draft picks? You get that on tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos. We'll see you then, Broncos Country. Let's ride.